Welcome to the Learning Beyond Letter Grades module dedicated to exploring the affordances and limitations of letter grades. In this module, we're going to focus on two basic questions. Question number one, what are the benefits of letter grades or the arguments made in favor of letter grades? Question number two, what are some of the potential limitations of letter grades that exist? Largely, the rest of this course is dedicated to exploring some alternatives to letter grades or some things that can be used alongside letter grades to address maybe some of their limits or limitations. Let me start with a quick reference to a text called Mass Customized Learning in an Age of Empowerment. In this text, the authors argue that typical schools have certain load-bearing walls. They use the analogy of load-bearing walls in a building. Those are the walls that sort of hold the facility up, hold the building up. And you can't just go in and pull that wall out without putting something in its replacement. Otherwise, the building itself will fall down. Well, they argue that one of the load-bearing walls in many schools and learning organizations is the letter grade system. So if someone went in and just sort of tore apart or ripped out the letter grade system and didn't replace it with something else, that would be irresponsible, and it would probably leave the place in a much worse condition than it was before. That's part of why it's important for us to think about both the benefits and the limits of letter grades as we dive into the rest of this course. So let's get started. You'll have some readings and additional resources to go more in depth, but let me just give you a quick overview. So for the 5 arguments in favor of letter grades, in my conversations with many people and in my readings, I come across 5 basic themes or arguments in favor of letter grades. The first one is simply that letter grades are a motivator for students, and that's hard to deny. Some people are really motivated by trying to earn at least a C or to get a B or to get an A in the course, and that keeps them going and it keeps them motivated. The question is, if you were to remove those letter grades, would you remove the motivation necessary for them to succeed? It's a valid argument, and it's a valid point to make, and it's one that we certainly want to explore and to consider. The second one would be that the next level of education uses letter grades. So if one is in elementary school, the high school that they're going to uses letter grades. Or if they're in a high school, the university uses it. And universities sometimes even have grade point average as one of the factors that they consider to admit students. Of course, universities accept students from many organizations and many environments that don't use letter grades. There are ways to get around it, but it might be seen as complicating things a little bit more than it needs to. A third argument would be moving away from letter grades is really a sign of decreasing academic rigor. So some people make it really difficult to earn an A in the class, and that's how they see themselves maintaining academic rigor. So if you were to remove the letter grade system, would it also remove that sense of rigor? People argue that rigor is attached to letter grades. There are certainly many ways to maintain and promote academic rigor in a gradeless environment, but grades do serve that role in many institutions as it stands. A fourth argument for letter grades in favor of them is that it allows us to compare student performance across learning organizations. So if one has a GPA of a 4.0 and they share that, someone has a sense that, well, that means that that's a high performing student. Of course, we don't have any evidence that earning an A at one school is the same as earning an A at another school. They might have very different standards, and one might have very low standards, one very high standards, and yet there is still that sense that a person who has a high GPA is a higher performer. There's a concern that if we remove that, do we remove the ability to have that kind of conversation across organizations and that sort of common language? A fifth argument then is that letter grades work fine, so why change? And this is an argument saying that there are many high-performing schools and learning organizations that have a letter grade system. So why get rid of it? There are so many other issues that are important for us to consider. Why necessarily get rid of the letter grade system? And that's a great point. And it's for that reason that the purpose of this course is not ultimately to argue that we should get rid of letter grades, but it's simply learning beyond letter grades. So if we're a school that chooses to use letter grades, we also choose to use forms of assessment, especially formative assessment, that can help us help our students in some really powerful and significant ways. And at the same time, some people might actually want to consider removing letter grades entirely, but they're going to have to answer that question. if they're working all right, and if we can have some other quality improvements that really get at the key issues, do we need to get rid of the letter grade system or not? Some schools choose yes after evaluating it, and some say no. Now let's talk also then about questionable uses of letter grades. I was told by a wise man once that we learn too late that our convictions matter. So I'll make it very clear that I'm not going to be neutral on these topics. My opinion, my perspectives, informed by my study and my research and my thought on the matter, will show up over and over again in this. I'm not asking you to accept my perspective. I'm inviting you to share your own and to take your own stand and to figure out what you believe and think about this as well. But here are 5 that I would argue as questionable uses of letter grades. One is using letter grades as a punishment. Imagine the students come into the class. They're not prepared. They didn't do their readings. They're not ready for the class discussion. The frustrated teacher says, "Clear off your desks and take out a blank sheet of paper. We're having a pop quiz." And the teacher perhaps does that multiple times throughout the year. And they count those grades on the quiz as part of the overall grade in the class. So because students were unprepared, they earn a lower grade in the class. Now that may be people may argue that that's perfectly fine and acceptable, but it does mean that the letter grade does not simply mean that it's not simply a measure of what they have or haven't learned. Their preparation and other things like that are also at play. Because it's possible, for example, that a student didn't come to class and they weren't prepared at that moment, but maybe after the quiz, they had a wake-up call and they read what they were supposed to have read for that day, and they caught up and they studied, but they kept going through that cycle. So they got really low scores on the pop quizzes over and over, but they still learned the content. And by the end of the course, maybe they knew what they needed to know. And the letter grade doesn't reflect that in that kind of an instance. So as a punishment, it's questionable. There might be other ways to get at that. The second is as a carrot. So some people, if you do this, then you'll earn this grade. And that's a reality. And in fact, some of the alternatives to letter grades or the enhancements to letter grades, they also have this same questionable use or challenge. But we do ultimately want to try to get at some intrinsic motivators. Our goal, even though we may not always accomplish it, is that students are driven to learn because they're curious about a question. They want to find an answer. They have some motivations inside that drive them to pursue it, and it's not just to get this carrot. A third is as a judgment of student ability and commitment to academic excellence. So if a student gets a C, does that mean they lack ability? Or does it mean that they lack a commitment to academic excellence? I'm not quite sure that's a fair assessment just based on a student's letter grade. There are many factors that come into play. Maybe a student is really interested in certain topics and they dig in, but at the jeopardy of other topics in the class. So they're committed to academic excellence in a sense, just not academic excellence as it's measured or as it's qualified with a letter grade system in a particular class. Also, capability. There are many things that determine whether or not students succeed in the class, not just what grade they get in the class. It's not just academic ability. So that's a questionable use as well. A fourth one would be that letter grades can be used as a measure of student learning in the class. That also, I will argue, is questionable because, as I've mentioned in previous examples, maybe a student, part of their grade is based on how prepared they were, their behavior in their class, their participation in class discussions. Now, all of those may be valuable things, and people choose to make that part of the grade. But maybe some students don't perform as well. They're not always prepared on time. Maybe they turn things in late, but they learn everything they're supposed to learn by the end of the class. So they know what they're supposed to know. They meet the course objectives, and yet the letter grade does not reflect that they know as much as they think they do in some of those instances. So it's not always a really strong measure of student learning. The last one then is as a reliable indicator of future success beyond school. There are countless examples of people who didn't perform very well in terms of letter grades at a particular level, but later on they perform very, very well. And later on in work they perform very well. There are many other factors that contribute to people's success in different aspects of their life than just letter grades. So those are 5 that I propose as some questionable uses. You're going to have a chance to explore these topics through your readings and your own thinking on this matter and your conversations perhaps with colleagues a bit more, but these are some ideas to get you started.